So I want to talk a little bit more about the books. I last one video I kind of stopped abruptly because um, within the next minute I had like two or three little flubs and I was like, I'm just gonna stop it. So that's why this is a separate video. Anyway, so as far as it goes, the book is kind of an interesting. I mean, I want to give you a little bit of the history, a little bit of how the industry is working at this time, and so it's a little bit of both. Now, the book is kind of the first of what we might call the mass communication or the mass media. Mass media or mass communication is the idea that communication requires you to have a speaker. I'm trying to figure out where this is going to show up my screen. So you have a speaker, right, and you have a receiver, right. Moving the wrong way. Speaker, receiver, and the speaker sends a message, encodes it. This person receives it, decodes it, the message, and then sends feedback back to the communicator, the speaker, and then they communicate and vice versa. And that's how kind of interpersonal communication goes, right? All right, that was the first chapter. Now, mass communication, on the other hand, you have the speaker or the communicator, and then you have lots of people receiving the message, right? You have lots of different people. And so, they speak and they give the feed, but there is a feedback loop, and the feedback comes from people writing to the author, people buying more books, people saying this is the best book ever, that the communicator is like, oh, I did a good job, they must have liked this, and they then know how to revise it. So there is a feedback component, but it's basically where one person is sending a message, it's being received, and then in the process they respond, which is receptive. But mass media is a little bit less easily done that way. Now, as far as mass first form, because the newspaper, which is another print form, I mean, there was no electronic communication, what most of us think of like the internet, text messages, phone calls, radio, TV, records, recorded music, anything like that. I mean, none of those forms of communication would have existed on a mass scale. I mean, maybe there would have been concerts and plays, but that would have been about the only thing before the book. The book would really be the first one that's kind of what we maybe in the modern age consider a form of mass communication. And essentially, you have a person who writes a book, they publish the book, and then they send it out. Well, with the invention of the printing press in the late or early, it was around 1500, that basically with the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg, it allows for the first time books to be easily printed. Before that, I mean, the only way you would get books, there were books, Plato, the Bible, a lot of these things were books that were around. But, somebody wrote them, and then what would happen is if somebody thought this is really great, other people need to read it, they would hand copy the entire book for the they would hand copy the entire book for the world to read, right? I mean, they would sit there and just hand copy the entire thing. And so mainly it would be monks and scholars who would do this, and they would maybe, it may take a few months to do it, in a way that was legible, or a month to do it, or maybe even a few weeks if you were really quick and you sat there all day doing it. And so, I mean, the ability to reproduce books would have been extremely low. And so there would be very few books. It'd be mainly reserved for religious leaders, monasteries, universities, things like that. Well, as soon as Gutenberg comes along, Gutenberg realizes that if you create plates that have all the words on it, you can then smack it down over and over again. And you can then have like a movable text or a movable plate that allows you to slide in each page. And it makes it just, it was a whole movable system, and it was a series of being able to print pages. Now, Gutenberg took his time, and it took him several years to print his first book, which was the Bible. He printed around 100 of them, but the idea of being able to reproduce 100 Bibles in just a couple of years, and then he had the plates, and he could do it again if he wanted, it still would have probably taken him months to do. He could have done another 100 and put them together, and it would have taken a long time. But the idea that happening is absolutely just, it was absolutely unbelievable, the idea that could have ever occurred, right? And so what happens is because this takes, suddenly the book becomes able to be reproduced by one person, hundreds of copies in a year versus 3 or 4 copies in a year. And suddenly the book becomes a lot more accessible. And suddenly the book becomes something that most people get. Now, as we move along through history, we begin realize that books were still very expensive, because even at that, I mean, the book, like the first book. Well, let's talk about the first book. The first book was the Gutenberg Bible. He printed like 100 copies. I think there's only around like, I want to say there's maybe 10, maybe 6 left. There's a copy of it, I believe. I forget if it's. There's one university who owns it. I forget if it's Texas or Chicago. One of those. And then there's a copy at the Huntington Gardens out in California. I think it's the Huntington. It's a big garden. They have it's a really nice garden, but they have a museum as part of it. It's been donated by that family. And I have gone and seen the Gutenberg Bible there, and I think it's one of 2 or 3 copies in the United States. There's a couple copies in Europe, and I think there's like 6 copies, maybe 10. You can Google it if you really want. But there's only a few copies of what was the first book. Of the 100 original printings, there's only like 6 of them that remain. They, as far as they go, I mean, they would be considered priceless. I mean, if you wanted to buy one of these, I don't think anybody would even sell it that owns it, universities or anything. But if they came into hard times and had to, I'm guessing, you could sell your Gutenberg Bible for $100 million, $50 million. I mean, that would be such a rare item, such an important milestone that people would pay unbelievable amounts of money. I don't even think anybody would sell it who owns it. So what happens is that becomes a very big thing, because what happens is this then allows for people to read. Largely, you would have had a non-literate society that, how did you get your news? How did you get your information? Word of mouth. How did you do your entertainment? People would go to pubs and somebody would stand up and sing, or somebody would stand up and tell stories. And storytelling would have been a way, like, for example, people would have told stories, about religion or stories about history and other things. And that would have been the way information would have mainly been. There would have been books, but people would have memorized it and spoken it. And now it became possible for people to read this. And so what happens is that's kind of where the book comes in. The book, as far as it comes, let's talk more about in the United States, its role. The book came to the United States. Very few books came early on, because the book in itself, even in its early stages, would be like buying the iPhone 10 or whatever is the latest invention. They are not exactly cheap, and if you don't have the money, they didn't have financing for a phone back then. So, the only way to get one of these books would be to put the $1,000 or the $2,000 or the $3,000 down. And so, you can't finance it. You would have to save up, or you'd have to get some of your buddies, and all of you'd have to come together and say, hey, let's all go together and buy this book, and we'll all read it, right? I mean, imagine that. I mean, you have to kind of put yourself in the shoes of, this is such an instrumental thing. This is like your iPhone or something like that. This is something you're going to buy, you're going to cherish, you're going to read it 55 times, because, that's just the way it is. Well, the books you're going to buy are going to be mainly religious, and they're going to be mainly things like a Bible, maybe some books that are really supportive of your biblical interpretation or biblical views. But that's going to be mainly the kinds of things you wouldn't mind reading 10 times. And but anyway, so when people came to the United States, were mainly coming here to escape religious persecution. So any books they had would have been religious, and they were largely of a lower class. They were poor. They were looking for opportunities. The people who had money weren't going, hey, let's go to this place that, there's no facilities. We can't hire any labor. We're going to have to work all day and toil. We can't just, unless you were really adventurous, you may be young, maybe had grand visions of what could be there. You weren't probably heading to the United States. People who came here were largely poor, uneducated, illiterate. They were largely religious groups. And so the fact is the books would have been very few, and they would have been mainly, if the books that were brought would have been mainly religious textbooks. So books, however, became quickly a sign of wealth. And the other reason why you wouldn't bring me books, even if you could afford a book, is books are heavy. I mean, like a hardback, hand-bound, sewn together by hand, would weigh 5 pounds. If you ever moved and you've owned a lot of books, like I own, 500,000 books, right? Now, most of my books are in my office. Some of them are in some boxes. I don't even know where they're all at. But they're, I think, somewhere with my parents. And so, I have a lot of books. And every time I move, I'm always like, why the world do I have all of these books, right? These things are heavy, and it breaks your back to carry a box, right? And largely, I have a lot of paperbacks. And so paperbacks, and books and modern books use soft, lighter paper. I mean, this would not have been nearly as durable a process, and books aren't made to last as long. And so the books I have, even to this day, are not that uh, um, expensive, I suppose, would be the answer. And so what happens is or not expensive, but heavy. And so if you're going to get on a ship, I mean, you're bringing all your belongings. I mean, do you bring more shotguns, or something, or more, things like that, or do you bring books? Well, books would be a very big luxury. You wouldn't be able to bring tons of them. They would be too heavy for a boat, things like that. And so the number of books that would have been loaded onto boats would have been fairly, they would not have been a large number. And there was no way to print them here. And so finally in 1638, it says 18 years after Plymouth Rock, so this would have been, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So 146 years after the discovery of the Americas by Columbus, by Western Europeans. I mean, obviously there was a discovery before that, but the case is before the European move or migration to this continent. The first book arrives in around 1638, or not the first book, the first printing press, and they basically begin the process. They get a printing press and they print the first book, which is the Bay Psalm book, and then that's really the first book. There aren't a ton of books printed. I mean, they still take a lot of work. And the first book to really catch on was Benjamin Franklin in 1732 began printing the Poor Richard's Almanac. And a lot of people know of him from the Almanac, the Poor Richard's Almanac. I believe you can still go to a bookstore and buy. And it quickly sold 10,000 copies every year. This was largely information in a book form, giving information about, what's going on in the world, kind of a, planting information, seasonal information, what's the weather likely to be like, what are the temperatures, that all this kind of information that would be really kind of important to somebody, kind of, it would be like, like today, I mean, I'm walking, I'm like, when's the first frost going to be? Usually, typically in Central Illinois, the traditional first frost for this area is in mid-October, like October 12th. And that becomes somewhat important because that's when any last vegetation begins to die off. Farmers can, who had late plantings, definitely can assure that their beans are going to begin to dry up, things like that, drop their leaves, and as well as um, uh, um, as well as uh, that that would have been when the leaves would begin to drop, things like that, and so that would be important information. Today you would just Google that. Maybe you'd say, when's the first frost typically, or when will we get the first frost? That would be the way you would do it. Is you would have this book, and that became very important. Sold 10,000 copies. That would have been a huge selling for a book in that day and age, because 10,000 copies in a population of probably only a few 100,000 people would have been a huge selling. I mean, maybe there were 1 million people. I would have to look back. But I mean, the population of the United States would not have been 300 million. So this would have been a huge seller. And of course, a book. This would have been fairly inexpensive. It was full of useful facts and figures. But it was possible. Now, the other thing that made this possible, as well as books, is we began to finally get beyond that early stages, the first couple hundred years in the United States, where people began to actually have a little more leisure time, a little more free time to do it. And so that's all of some importance. So the novel is sort of becoming invented in the 1700s around this time, which leads the way to the first novel to be printed in North America. Was a book by called Pamela, and it was by Samuel Richardson. And one of the early things that came across with the printing press was that printing became highly known as, the United States was a colony, and so anything that was printed in the colonies oftentimes was by people who were hundreds of miles, thousands of miles, not hundreds, thousands of miles away from the king, and maybe had some resentment of the fact that these were usually people who could own printing presses, who brought them in, were usually community pillars, and there was some resentment. And so the printing press quickly became a source of information that may not have been widely seen as, it would have been seen as an act of dissent from the crown.